Welcome, everyone. So today we're tackling the final and maybe the most essential pivot in the caregiving journey. We're drawing from Jessica Lee and Johnny Faith's guide, Spotting Alzheimer's Early.
Yeah,
For a lot of these deep dives, we really focus on the actionable stuff, right? The checklists, navigating the medical system, dealing with burnout.
the practicalities.
Exactly, the practicalities. But in this volume, the authors, they kind of save the most profound work for last, I think.
They definitely do. We're zooming right in on Chapter 10, which is called Wrapping Up Your Caregiving Journey with Purpose. And, this chapter is different.
How so?
Well, it really shifts the entire focus. It moves away from the person being cared for and puts the spotlight squarely onto the caregiver's own identity.
Yeah.
It sort of demands a reckoning with the immense effort, the emotional sacrifice, everything involved.
Right. Right. We've walked through the early days in previous discussions, that shock of realizing something's off, the whole challenge of getting a diagnosis, the work of building support networks, all that. Chapter 10 feels like it's designed to take all those, fragmented, often really scary moments and bring the whole experience full circle, as they say.
Exactly. It's about taking that history and turning it into something useful for the future, a resource.
What's fascinating, I think, is that Chapter 10 and its partner in the playbook, Step 10, Meaningful Legacy, it isn't just a summary at the end of the book.
Not at all. It's really an exercise.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that all those years spent in, crisis mode sometimes,
Yeah.
the emotional cost, the physical toll, that it wasn't just about survival. It's about seeing it as something profound, a source of growth and wisdom you can actually pass on.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Our mission today. We're going to analyze this really crucial final chapter using 5 specific areas. We'll look at the core concept, the emotional hook, what the chapter promises for the future, the actual blueprint for creating this legacy, and then, our overall take on it.
It's all good.
So let's start with that big reframing piece the authors kick off with. What exactly is the central argument here? I mean, we've spent 9 chapters focused on taking action, right? Tracking symptoms, building support. What's the final internal action this chapter is asking the caregiver to take?
Well, the central argument, and they state this pretty clearly right at the start of the playbook Step 10 summary, is that caregiving has to be seen as, and I'm quoting loosely here, not just a set of tasks. It is a profound journey filled with challenges, growth, and meaning.
Okay.
So the pivot, it's really psychological. It's about reframing that difficult, sometimes frankly traumatic reality of caregiving into, almost a heroic narrative.
That sounds good, in theory. But I imagine if you're deep in the weeds managing daily confusion or coordinating endless appointments, that word profound might feel pretty far off.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why the authors make a really important distinction. They say wrapping up the journey doesn't necessarily mean caregiving itself is over. I mean, the disease progresses, right? But it means starting a deliberate phase of creating perspective, closure, and a sense of purpose. It's about choosing intentionally to move beyond that reactive mode that probably defined the whole early diagnostic phase.
Yeah, the constant firefighting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And moving into a time of intentional reflection.
So it's kind of like a call for the caregiver to take back control of the story.
Yes.
Instead of the disease defining everything, the relationship, the experience, the caregiver actually gets to choose what meaning they pull from it.
Precisely. And to guide this pretty monumental shift, they lay out these 3 pillars of legacy. These really structure the whole chapter in Playbook Step 10.
Okay, what are they?
So first is reflecting on lessons learned. Basically using all those notes and journals you hopefully kept to actually process your own personal growth. Second is preserving memories, which is, a direct pushback against what the disease does.
Okay.
And third is finding meaning and purpose. And this is about turning the personal journey into a lasting legacy by sharing what you learned.
That third pillar feels really powerful because it takes something that's often so isolating, so private, caregiving, which we talked about in Chapter 9, and it assigns it this high transferable value. Like the expertise you gain through sheer hardship is now presented as a public good.
That's the core of it. That's the foundation. The book is essentially saying, look, that incredibly difficult path you walked, the resilience you had to find every single day, that wasn't just survival. It's curriculum.
Curriculum. I like that.
Knowledge that can and actually should be formalized and shared. It fundamentally shifts the caregiver's identity from someone who is, just suffering through this to someone who is genuinely wise because of it.
Right.
So if the core foundation is this shift in perspective, then the emotional hook is really the why.
Okay.
Why should a caregiver who is probably busy, definitely exhausted, maybe still right in the thick of managing difficult behaviors or complex logistics,
Yeah.
why should they stop and do this big reflective exercise?
That's a good question.
Well, this chapter uses the promise of emotional relief
Right.
and renewal as its most powerful lure.
Okay, let's dig into that because the source material, it consistently emphasizes the harsh reality of caregiver burnout, the loneliness themes we saw back in chapters 8 and 9.
Yeah.
So what's the concrete, immediate emotional payoff that's promised by focusing on this perhaps seemingly abstract idea of legacy?
I think the main hook is the promise of personal healing and, importantly, validation. Caregivers often carry so much guilt, right? They measure themselves against some impossible standard.
Always feeling like they're not doing enough.
Exactly. And the process of reflection, especially when you actually document your history, it provides concrete evidence of your efforts, your resilience. And this comes through so clearly in the case study. They use Angela's story in Playbook Step 10.
Angela's story really is moving. I think the core takeaway from her experience, the hook really, is that by taking her years of just personal notes and putting them together into a simple booklet she could share, she found healing for herself and dignity for her mother's story. That connection they draw between contributing something externally and finding internal healing. Wow, that's incredibly compelling.
It really is.
It basically tells you, the listener, look, your struggle isn't just pain, it's the raw material for dignity, both for you and the person you cared for.
It validates the sacrifice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All that deep, often painful effort involved in early detection, planning, navigating everything. It's given this final positive outcome that actually transcends the disease itself. And beyond that, the hooks are also really practical. They speak directly to that identity crisis so many caregivers face when they've had to put their own lives completely on hold.
Right. Let's look at the specifics in the Step 10 action checklist. I noticed one instruction seemed laser-focused on regaining that lost identity.
Yes, that's the call to reconnect with hobbies, relationships, or professional goals that may have been on hold. Think about it for a caregiver who's been operating in a state of, prolonged emergency, which is what those early phases of Alzheimer's management often feel like.
Constantly putting out fires.
Yeah. Your personal identity just shrinks dramatically. So this instruction, it's a direct, almost visceral promise of getting yourself back. It gives permission to step back into your own life.
Yeah.
And importantly, it frames it as a critical part of the legacy process, not just some selfish afterthought.
That feels profound because it directly tackles that fear that maybe the person you were before all this started is just gone forever.
Exactly.
And by formalizing this return, actually revisit that hobby or look into that professional goal on a checklist, the chapter basically says you are owed your future back.
And we shouldn't overlook the psychological hook that ties back to grief, which was a big theme in chapter 8.
Okay.
The instruction to preserve memories, to create a memory box, a digital archive, that's a really powerful therapeutic technique. It directly confronts the anxiety and the deep sorrow that comes with watching a loved one's memories just fade.
So instead of just passively witnessing the loss, you're actively doing something. You're asserting control over the past.
Precisely.
You're cementing the vibrant history, the photos, the stories, the letters of the person they were. You're giving that history a kind of permanence. It shifts the focus, doesn't it, from the future loss of identity to the past continuity of identity.
Exactly. So the hook really works, I think, because it validates the caregiver's current exhaustion, but also offers this clear, structured path towards emotional recovery. It makes sure you understand that doing this chapter's work is ultimately an act of, radical self-care. It's a necessity, not some luxury add-on.
Okay, so since this is the final chapter of Part 1 of Volume 1, it can't just be about closure, right? It has to act as a launch pad, too. So what specific promises does Chapter 10 make to the reader about, the rest of the book, the playbook, and also the bigger, longer-term journey of living with Alzheimer's?
Yeah, that's a great point. Chapter 10 really functions as the theoretical capstone for Playbook Step 10, meaningful legacy. So the immediate promise is practical. Here's a roadmap, a clear action checklist to actually achieve that legacy. And that checklist essentially guarantees that all those different often challenging tasks you undertook in the earlier steps, they'll now be consolidated into something coherent and meaningful.
That consolidation piece feels really important. It takes all those separate, maybe fear-driven actions from the early days, like keeping that detailed symptom journal from way back,
Chapter 3, yeah.
or maybe frantic notes you scribbled down during the diagnosis period, and it gives them a final reflective purpose. It kind of synthesizes the entire first volume into a cohesive whole. It promises that none of that effort was wasted.
Absolutely. And beyond just consolidation, it promises concrete ways out of the isolation that we talked about, being such a struggle in Chapter 9.
How does it do that?
Specifically, it promises a clear path to leverage your newfound expertise. The instruction is to give back to the caregiving community, maybe through mentoring, maybe volunteering. This promises you that your personal hardship can actually become a communal asset. It directly fights that feeling of being utterly alone in this.
And it also sets up the next critical phase of self-care, right? It doesn't just suggest renewal, it actually formalizes it.
Precisely. It promises future structure for self-care by telling you to set personal next steps that prioritize your own health and life goals. It even gets specific, telling you to, say, revisit a support group from Chapter 9 by month's end.
So it makes it accountable.
Yes, this promise is structural. It guarantees you have a process in place to stop yourself from slipping back to those old patterns of self-neglect.
But maybe the biggest promise, and arguably the most vital one for managing that long-term anxiety, is the way they explicitly tease future volumes.
Yes, that's crucial.
It feels like they're not just trying to sell more books, they're actively managing the fear of the unknown. That fear that, okay, once this initial diagnostic panic is over, where do I turn next? Do the resources just dry up?
This is such a critical point. The source material very clearly lays out 2 future volumes. Volume 2 promises to tackle navigating daily life with Alzheimer's, so strategies for daily management, routines.
The nitty-gritty of living with it day to day?
Exactly. Which directly addresses how the disease evolves and the need for new, practical tools that go beyond Volume 1's focus on early detection and initial planning.
And then Volume 3 is dedicated entirely to preventing caregiver burnout, focusing on, like, advanced self-care and boundary setting.
Which is the absolutely logical, necessary follow-up to the emotional tools introduced back in Chapter 8.
Okay.
So the overall promise here is really threefold, and it's incredibly comprehensive. You get immediate emotional reflection and consolidation of the journey so far. You get a guaranteed structured way back into your personal life, and maybe most importantly, you get guaranteed intellectual and emotional support for the long haul.
So the authors are essentially promising that this purpose you find in Chapter 10 isn't the end point, but the solid foundation you need to manage the evolving chronic nature of the disease for years to come.
Exactly. It bridges the diagnostic phase to the long-term management phase.
Okay, the learner-listener in me always loves structure. We've talked about the philosophy, the why behind this legacy idea, but now let's really dive into the tangible steps. What does the source material actually instruct a caregiver to do to achieve this meaningful legacy? This is the action blueprint. How do they make this abstract concept concrete?
Right. The chapter uses that very structured roadmap playbook approach to make sure the idea of purpose becomes, well, completely practical and actionable.
Yeah.
We can break this legacy blueprint down into 3 key phases of action. And what's neat is how they ensure every emotional investment you made earlier in the book gets used here. Hashtag A. Consolidation and reflection.
Okay, phase 1, consolidation and reflection. How do they tell someone to start consolidating a journey that, let's be honest, was probably chaotic, rushed, maybe filled with conflicting advice?
So the first main action is reviewing your notes and journals. Specifically, the source material points you back to that symptom journal, the tracking tool they encouraged you to start way back in Chapter 3.
Okay.
And the instruction is specific. Look back at your symptom journal, reflection questions, and progress over time.
I can see the immediate value there. That journal probably started as a tool driven by fear, right? Like needing proof for the doctor that something was wrong.
Exactly.
But now they're asking you to look at it differently as a record of your own endurance.
Precisely. The purpose shifts entirely. It becomes profoundly therapeutic. It lets you, the caregiver, actually observe how far you and your loved one have come together. It reinforces your own strength. It uses the hard evidence of past patience, past support, things that might have felt small or even meaningless in the moment to prove your own resilience. It's about validating your past efforts by looking at them through a new, more compassionate lens.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second action in this consolidation phase? Identifying core lessons learned. How do you formalize something as fluid as, emotional growth?
Right. So here the instruction moves from just personal documentation towards external communication. They ask you to actually write down your top, say, 3 to 5 insights.
Like what?
Oh, things like, I learned the real power of asking for help, or I discovered a level of patience I never knew I had, or maybe I learned to prioritize laughter even when routines fell apart.
Okay.
And then this is the crucial part, share them with family members. This step transforms your personal insight into a kind of functional family guidance document.
Ah, so it helps the wider support network.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It ensures your hard-won lessons benefit others and maybe even future generations within the family. It literally turns your private pain into shared wisdom. #B memory preservation. Okay, moving on from personal reflection. The next major phase is memory preservation. And this phase is so critical because it offers a direct, really powerful antidote to the devastation of the disease itself.
What are the tangible steps here? How does the chapter go beyond just saying, cherish your memories?
It's very focused and practical. The action is preserve memories. And the source material mandates specific steps. Collect photos, stories, or letters that capture meaningful caregiving moments. These aren't just random snapshots. They're moments that specifically represent the resilience of the relationship, the connection that endured.
What's the emotional engine behind this? Why is creating a physical thing like a scrapbook or a digital file, why is that so important for the caregiver's healing?
I think it's about asserting control over the narrative of loss. Alzheimer's, by its nature, works by systematically eroding history and identity.
Yeah, it's brutal.
It is. So by creating a memory box or an archive, the caregiver is performing an active countermeasure. They are physically or digitally asserting the permanence of the loved one's identity before the disease took hold, or even during moments of connection within the disease. They're creating a tangible artifact that resists being forgotten.
So it's like creative mourning.
That's a great way to put it. Channeling the pain of what's being lost into the creation of something meaningful, beautiful, lasting. And that process is deeply healing, especially for the specific kind of grief we discussed in Chapter 8, that anticipatory grief, mourning the person who is still physically there but mentally slipping away. #C, gifting and personal renewal.
Okay, this third phase sounds like where the legacy really branches out both outward by gifting expertise and inward by renewing the self. Let's start with the gifting part.
Right. This is the external expression of all that accumulated wisdom. The main action here is giving back to the caregiving community. And the suggestions are very concrete. Things like mentoring a support group, leveraging the resources you hopefully build back in Chapter 9, or maybe volunteering with Alzheimer's organizations.
That requires a huge identity shift, though. The person who started this book feeling overwhelmed, maybe desperately seeking help from a support group, is now being told to become the mentor, the expert guiding others.
It's the ultimate validation, isn't it? It formalizes their status as a subject matter expert, not just someone who happened to survive a difficult time. It transforms their personal hardship into an act of profound community service. And by honoring their loved one's journey through this kind of contribution, they ensure that the story of their struggle continues to have a positive ripple effect. It's absolutely essential for breaking that cycle of isolation we talked about.
And then finally, the crucial internal focus, personal renewal. This feels like the capstone to the whole self-care discussion from Chapter 8.
It absolutely is. That's the final critical action, setting personal next steps. This formally integrates self-care into the legacy process itself. The instruction is direct and, frankly, demanding. Reconnect with hobbies, relationships, or professional goals that may have been on hold. But they don't just leave it there. They also mandate structured, supportive action, telling you to, for example, revisit a support group from Chapter 9 by month end. This formalizes the caregiver's return to their own life. It makes it a legitimate, necessary part of building their legacy. They're essentially creating a blueprint for their next chapter, their post-intensive caregiving self.
That structural demand feels important. It prevents self-care from being just a vague, nice-to-have suggestion. It makes it a measured, accountable step, just like tracking symptoms was at the very beginning.
Exactly. It gives it weight. Okay, let's try and synthesize all of this. If you, our listener, can only hold on to one single idea from this entire chapter, the one shift in perspective that really changes everything, what is that key takeaway?
For me, the ultimate synthesis, and Angela's story really drives this home, is the idea that the journey, even though it's incredibly difficult, often defined by loss, it can and absolutely should be transformed into a legacy of love, resilience, and contribution. The key takeaway is that perspective shift itself. You didn't just endure the diagnosis, the mood swings, the logistical nightmares. You actively built something through that process. You built a resource of wisdom, you built documentation, you built resilience.
You build expertise.
Yeah.
You built a documented history of both the challenges and the moments of connection. And you built this deep sense of personal competence that the disease itself cannot touch or erase. That shift from a narrative purely of suffering to one of enduring contribution, that's the ultimate message for someone who, for 9 chapters, has probably felt mostly reactive, just trying to cope.
Which leads us right into our final point, the critique and evaluation. Does this chapter actually succeed? Does it achieve its really ambitious goals of providing closure, demanding reflection, and setting a path for the future?
Overall, I think it succeeds immensely, and primarily because it avoids that common trap of ending a difficult book with just some vague, feel-good sentiment.
Yeah, no empty platitudes here.
No, it navigates really challenging emotional territory, but it immediately grounds all that reflective work in concrete, actionable steps through the playbook. That makes a huge difference.
Okay, but let's push back a little. Let's introduce some critical friction. Is it really fair for the book to demand this kind of deep, reflective, purposeful work from a caregiver who might still be right in the middle of a daily crisis, or someone who is just grieving profoundly? Is there a risk of adding a layer of, like, legacy guilt? That feeling that if you don't produce this beautiful, consolidated narrative, you've somehow failed the final test.
That's a really valid point. It's a potential pitfall. I think the authors manage this risk primarily through the tone they maintain. The language stays consistently compassionate and empowering.
How so?
Well, they consistently treat the caregiver as an expert who has earned the right to reflect, rather than just someone being assigned more homework. Phrases like profound journey and legacy of love, they frame this work as something cathartic and necessary for the caregiver's own recovery and well-being, rather than just another obligation owed to the person they're caring for or the situation.
Okay, I see that. And I think the success is also really boosted by how well it integrates everything that came before.
Absolutely.
It masterfully uses the tools and themes from literally every preceding chapter to provide that sense of closure. It takes the tracking from Chapter 3, the resilience focus from Chapter 4, the support networks from Chapter 7, the self-care mandate from Chapter 8, and it synthesizes them all into this final, purposeful act and document.
And that sustained focus on the caregiver's future, not just the immediate care task at hand. That's probably the chapter's strongest point. By explicitly laying out the promises of Volume 2 and Volume 3, they acknowledge the complexity, the sheer longevity of this journey.
Right, they don't pretend this is the end.
Exactly. They don't pretend that achieving legacy suddenly solves everything or marks the end of the road. Instead, they frame it as the crucial preparation needed for the marathon still ahead. It provides closure on that initial diagnostic phase while simultaneously establishing a foundation of purpose for the ongoing long-term management phase.
So in that sense, Chapter 10 really serves as the ultimate act of self-validation and, well, future-proofing for the reader.
Well put. Future-proofing is a great term for it. #HagO
So we've really seen today that Chapter 10 is fundamentally about transforming that often difficult narrative of caregiving into a purposeful legacy. It's a disciplined shift, moving from just surviving day to day to intentional reflection, preserving memories, and making an external contribution. You now have the knowledge not just of early detection and navigating the medical side, but also how to harness your own emotional growth into a sustainable future for yourself.
Yeah, and the sources really emphasize that by taking this final reflective step, by consciously creating a legacy, you are actively securing your own psychological and emotional well-being for the longer term. You're consciously integrating the massive lessons you've learned, making sure that the difficult history you navigated becomes a foundational part of your strength, rather than just, a source of ongoing trauma or burnout.
And look, you're already making a difference just by seeking out and internalizing this knowledge. Now, the challenge is to take that meaningful legacy idea and actually apply it in some small way. Maybe that means finally compiling your own notes from the early stages into a document that could help a sibling or another family member down the road. Or maybe it's just taking that one structured step to rejoin a hobby you had to put aside. Even the smallest act of intentional reflection is the beginning of building that legacy.
And remember that structural promise we talked about. The authors have explicitly prepared you for what comes next. They acknowledge the evolving nature of Alzheimer's and the continuing need for self-protection. And we, here, will continue to explore those necessary next steps for caregivers in future deep dives. We'll dig deeper into those long-term realities teased in the source material, things like the daily management routines promised in Volume 2 and the advanced self-care and boundary-setting techniques from Volume 3 that are so essential for preventing burnout over the long haul.
This entire deep dive, really, from the very first subtle sign we discussed ages ago right through to this final purposeful reflection, has been about empowering you through knowledge and building resilience through structure.
Which brings us to a final important question, one that only you, the listener, can really answer. If caregiving truly is this profound journey, defined partly by the documentation you kept and the resilience you demonstrated, what small piece of your own hard-won experience are you ready to formalize and share today? Even if it's just sharing it with yourself in a journal. How will the difficult wisdom you've acquired help light the way for the next person who picks up this book, just beginning their own path of observation, action, and ultimately finding meaning?